In the last few videos, we've been going over custom build targets and how you can leverage the internal exec command in a couple of different ways to take some action and then execute an external command as you would otherwise do. In this video, let's go ahead and use some actual real-world examples of where this is actually useful. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. ODAT Nerd here. Welcome to this video on actual use cases for custom exec targets. And before we get started with this video, just as a reminder, if you're finding these videos in any way helpful or useful, please use those buttons down there below to thumb and subscribe and share as you deem appropriate. And if you have any questions on the content of this video, any of my videos, or suggestions for other video topics you'd like me to cover, drop those down in the comment section below or hit me on Twitter at ODATNerd. But we are here to actually learn some real world use cases for the stuff that we've been learning up to now. And just to note, if you're coming to this video and you haven't watched the others, you might want to go back and watch some of the previous videos because we're not going to cover how the exec command is actually working and how our templates are doing what they do, or how to use the target and cancel keys in your build system. That's a previous topic. Here we're just covering 3 different things you can use what we've learned to do, which might actually be useful. Now here's the first thing we're going to cover. We know when you run a build that this panel appears in the bottom of the window. This is controlled by a setting in the default preferences called show panel on build. Its default value is true. And the result of that is when a build happens, this panel pops up. Now, sometimes you might not want this to appear here the way it does, and you could change the setting. But what if you wanted to change that on a build system by build system basis? Or this is another thing you might want to use this for. The exec command itself is what is responsible for opening this up. So if you try to use the exec command as part of a key binding or a menu entry or a command palette entry to just run an arbitrary command because you pressed a key, it will honor the setting and open this up even if you don't want it to. But using what we've already learned, we can fix that. And to do that, the first thing we would do is say we want to create a new plugin. And of course, if you haven't added this to your command palette, you can go to Tools Developer, New Plugin to do the same thing. And as is our want, so we can view as less typing of me as possible, I'm going to go ahead and paste in this example code and save it as custom exec.py like so. Now we've seen in the previous video how this is subclassing the exec command so that we can just do whatever we want and then call super.run to actually execute the build. So what we're actually doing here is grabbing the a loaded copy of the preferences.sublime settings, that's your Sublime user settings, and then we get the value of the show panel on build setting. We then check to see if our arguments were given with an argument of override panel, and the default value of that is false if it's not provided. And if the value is true, then we flip the show panel on build settings state by setting it to its opposite, run the build, and then flip the setting back to what it was originally. And by using that, what we can do, and we're going to just come up here and grab this value here, go into our build system where instead of the exec target, we want to have the override panel exec instead, which, because we're not using that new key, behaves exactly identically to what the exec command already does. But if we add that panel argument in and say true, now when we close that, when we come over here and run this build, like so, we don't see the build output. We do see it say in the status line that the build happens. I'll even push it again. We can see the status line says build finished. But what we can actually do is come up here if we want to tools, build results, show build results to see the build results there. You can of course also use the panel chooser to choose build results to see the same thing. So if you had the need to have a version of the exec command that make sure that that setting is not set temporarily. This is an example of how you could do that very thing. And because we're not saving the settings, this is just a temporary thing. So your settings file on disk is left untouched. Now, the second thing we're going to cover here that is commonly asked is being able to take the selected text and pass it to the build system as a variable to do something with it. I've seen people ask for this because they're running some sort of test harness system and they can specify the actual test to run, and you could select the test you want to run before you run the build, is one example of why you might want to do something like that. This is also actually a pretty easy to do, and so we'll go ahead and paste that in, and I'm going to scroll this up like so. Now here we have a new command called grab selection exec, and what does this do? Well, it grabs from the window all of the variables that would normally happen in a build system. We've seen that in a previous thing. This is the file path, project directory, all that good stuff. It also grabs the currently active view in the window, which is the one that was active when the build command was executed. And if that view doesn't have an empty selection, it will grab the first selection and add a variable named selection with that as the value. Now, this only works if there's a single cursor. If there's multiple cursors, if there's two or more, this always uses the first one, the one higher up in the file. You'd have to adjust this if you want to grab the selection from multiple places. And then we expand variables in our keyword arguments using the variables that we were provided here, and then go ahead and pass that on to run. Now, something to keep in mind here is that when Sublime executes a build, some of the build variables, and we're going to go ahead and jump right over here to the build, in particular the command, shell command, and working dir fields, and there's more information on this in the linked documentation below. Variables in those are expanded before the custom target is invoked, because in that usually in this case, for example, what we're doing here, we don't want to be responsible for expanding $file in shell command in the general case. So it does that for us. And as a part of expanding variables, if there are any variables that it doesn't understand or that it doesn't know the value for, it just goes ahead and assumes that their value is empty and expands them right away. And that's going to make more sense in just a second. So the first thing we need to do is, of course, change this target from that to grab selection exec instead. And we're going to turn that off because this build no longer supports that argument. And we are also going to comment that out and make our own shell command. And we might just go ahead and say echo and use the variable selection, and we'll say no selection like so, and fix that up. Now, this will run the command echo, and echo will just echo whatever you provided, right? Now, selection is a variable here that we have just added. If the selection variable doesn't have a value, then the value that you see is the value after the colon there. This is the same as it works in snippets. So theoretically, that should work the way you want, except remember, I just said that Sublime expands variables in some fields when it executes a target. Shell command is one of those. And as it's expanding variables, if it sees any variables that it doesn't know the value of, it assumes their value is the empty string and replaces them right away. And that means that the way this build currently stands, if I was to come over here and run the build, it says no selection, which makes sense because there's no selection. But even if the first line of the main function was selected, it still says no selection. And the reason for that is this variable got expanded to be the value no selection just right at the point where the command was actually executed. In order to tell Sublime not to handle something like this, and this also occurs anytime you just want a $sign in something like shell command, you need to quote it by putting a slash in front of it. And when Sublime passes through this, it replaces the slash dollar with a $sign and otherwise doesn't treat it as special. That would leave the variable alone. In our case, this is a JSON file, and slash dollar sign is being interpreted, as we can see by the syntax highlighting, as a character escape of the dollar sign, and that's not valid JSON. So now the build is technically just broken and won't work at all. But we can add an extra slash in here like so. So slash slash in JSON is a single slash character, and then it is followed by the dollar sign. So when this gets loaded by Sublime, it sees slash dollar sign. Sublime ignores it and removes the slash. The variable comes through, and when we run the build, we get the first line as the selection. Now, here's a third thing you might want to do with the build system. What if you actually want to not grab the selected text and use it as part of a command line? What if you actually want to execute that selected text? A perhaps common example of this would be if you were using SQL, you could select some SQL lines and execute just those instead of the whole file. That, it turns out, is also fairly easy to do as well. So we're going to jump back over to here, and we're going to first of all jump to the top of the file because we're going to need a couple of extra imports for what we're about to do here. And in particular, we want to import the OS module, and we want to import the temp file module, because if we're going to use the selection and build the selection, we probably need to store the selection in a file so that we can pass it to the external command. So we're going to go ahead and add those in like so, and then we can drop back down here to the bottom of the file, and here is another exec command, and we'll just scroll that up like so. This provides us a command, execute selection exec command, which allows you to execute the selection. So here in our run method, the first thing we do is get the active view, which again is the one that the cursor was in when the build happened. And we check its first selection to see if it's empty. And if it is, we immediately bail and display a message in the status line that says cannot build, no selection, because we require a selection to build. Otherwise, we get the name of a temporary file from the selection. We'll cover that in just a second. Then we expand the variables just like we did before and run the exec command. Now here, we also have this get selection method. And what this is doing is just very simply creating a temporary file in your system's temporary directory, writing the selection from the currently active view to it, and returning its name, which is, as we see on line 45, stored in a variable. And this is an example of why you might want to know when a build is finished executing. In our finish method here, and again, watch that previous video where we covered this if you're not sure how that is working in this particular case. After calling the super version of the finish method, we remove the temporary file, catching any errors and ignoring them if there happens to be any, and then get rid of that file name. Now, in order to use this, again, we have to do a couple of things here. The first thing we have to do is jump to the build and change the name of grab selection exec to be our newly added execute selection exec instead. And we want to go back to using this here, but remember we are using a variable of name selection as the name of the selection file. We can see that right here on line 47. So in our build system, instead of $file, we want to say $selection as we did previously, and we want to add those two slashes in like so. We don't need to add a default value here for this like we did for the last one, because the build isn't going to allow anything to actually be built if there's not already a selection. So we can save that, and we come over to here. Now we're going to need two programs. So I'm going to copy this one and modify this one to say goodbye world. So now if I save that file, if I select this first program, when I run the build, it is building and says hello world. So it's executed that first part. If instead I select this program, when I run the build, it says goodbye world. And again, you could expand on this as appropriate, grab multiple selections, use this to execute only some SQL commands in a file and not all of them, stuff like that. So there we have three real-world examples for why you might want to create your own custom build target to tweak your builds. And of course, the world is your oyster when it comes to what you can do with this sort of functionality. I hope you found this useful and informative. If you have any questions or comments, if you need me to clarify anything, or you just have a suggestion for another video you'd like me to create, drop that down in the comment section below, or hit me on Twitter at ODATNerd. And of course, use those thumbie, likey, subscribey type buttons and the share buttons as you deem appropriate if you're getting any use out of this. But until the next video, this is ODATNerd asking you to please have a sublime day.